There is one angel spoken of in tones so low they almost sound like prayer. An entity so final, so unavoidable, that even the most towering names in heaven are said to regard him with a kind of instinctive caution, not because he is stronger in battle, and not because he stands above them in rank, but because his purpose is the one purpose no sword can resist, and no prophecy can postpone. Michael is the commander, the blade of heaven, the one who moves through war like lightning and does not tremble. Lucifer, before the fall, was brilliance and fire, a presence that once stood among the highest. And yet there is a presence described in ancient whispers as something even they would not challenge. Because this angel does not fight battles that can be won, and he does not carry messages that can be rejected. He ends stories, silently, without warning, with the stillness of an iron gate closing forever. He does not arrive like thunder, demanding attention. He arrives like gravity, demanding surrender. Because the moment he stands near, the soul understands something the mind cannot argue with, a truth older than fear and sharper than reason. Your time has reached its boundary, and the world will not make room for one more heartbeat. They called him Azrael, the angel of death. Some traditions say he can separate the soul from the body with a whisper so soft it feels like nothing at all, as if life itself is simply unthreaded from flesh, the way a flame is lifted from a wick. Others say that when Azrael appears, he does not need to touch you, threaten you, or even speak. The soul recognizes him the way dust recognizes the wind, the way night recognizes the moment the last light finally surrenders, because his presence carries one unmistakable announcement: the appointed hour has arrived. And when he comes, even the greatest angels step aside. Not in panic, not in protest, but in a profound, reverent yielding, because Azrael's authority does not come from ambition, violence, or rebellion. It comes from function, from divine assignment, from a role so heavy that it forces all creation to remember its limits. Where other angels defend, warn, guide, and proclaim, Azrael performs the one act that cannot be reversed, the one passage every living soul must eventually cross. This is Secret Origins, and today we are telling the story of the scariest angel that ever lived, an angel whose footsteps do not echo with battle, but with endings. Welcome. Long ago, before calendars learned to count, before the sun was measured by human hands, before history had a spine and a name, creation existed in a state that is almost impossible for the modern mind to imagine, because we were born into a world where endings are normal, where graves are familiar, where every breath carries the quiet knowledge that it will not last forever. But in the beginning, there was no such knowledge, not because creatures were stronger, or because suffering had simply been hidden, but because the very concept of death had not yet entered the design. The world was not yet complete. It was like a story still being written, a melody that had not reached its final chord, a door that had not yet been built, because you cannot close what has not been opened, and you cannot end what has not yet begun. There was no funeral dust in the wind, no aching goodbye, no last words trembling on a dying tongue, no shadow creeping across the edge of life like a thief. There was no appointed hour, because there were no human hours to appoint. There was only the vastness of divine order, the stillness of a creation waiting for its final pieces, and the quiet reality that life itself, as humanity would one day know it, had not yet stepped onto the stage. And that is the detail most people miss when they speak of death as if it has always been part of existence. Death was not eternal. Death was introduced. Before humans walked the earth, There was no human story to end, no fragile body to fail, no soul to be separated from flesh, because the vessel had not yet been shaped. Life had not begun in the way it would begin through Adam, through breath placed into dust. So the end of life was not yet a function in creation. You don't assign an angel to close a door when no one has ever walked through it. You don't forge a key for a lock that has never existed. So heaven moved in a different rhythm then, one without the sharp interruption of finality, one without the weight of mortality pressing on every moment. The world did not yet know the language of loss. Creation had beauty, order, purpose, but it had not yet received the human heartbeat that would one day make everything feel personal, vulnerable, and painfully precious. And somewhere beyond what eyes can see, beyond what tongues can name, the role Azrael would later carry did not yet exist. Because there was no death to deliver, no boundary to enforce, no soul to escort beyond the veil. Not yet. But all of that was about to change, with one single choice. In the beginning, the first man was formed, not from gold, not from stone, not from the substance of stars, but from something humbler and more mysterious. Dust gathered from the earth itself, shaped by the hand of God into a vessel designed to hold breath, purpose, and the unimaginable gift of communion. And when Adam opened his eyes, he did not wake into chaos, or hunger, or fear. He woke into Eden, a garden so complete that pain had no language there, a world so pure that sorrow had never learned to speak. Eden was not merely beautiful, it was ordered, sacred, untouched by the cracks that would later split the human heart. The air carried peace like incense. The ground did not fight the feet that walked upon it. The rivers ran without blood. The trees stood without rot. Every day was a living testimony that God's design was not survival. It was life, full and unbroken, without the shadow of an ending waiting in the distance. And in the center of that perfection, God gave a boundary, not as cruelty, but as covenant, not as a trap, but as a choice. There was one tree set apart, one command that marked the line between trust and rebellion, between submission and self-rule. The forbidden tree was not powerful because of its fruit. It was powerful because of what it represented. The question that has haunted humanity ever since. Will you trust God's word, or will you rewrite it? And then it happened. Adam and Eve disobeyed. They reached. They took from what had been forbidden. And in that single act, so small in motion, so massive in consequence, something entered the world that had never existed before. Sin was not merely a mistake, it was a fracture, a spiritual rupture, a turning of the human will away from the source of life, as if a branch had decided it could live without the tree. And the moment sin stepped into creation, it did not arrive alone. It brought a shadow behind it, long and cold and inevitable, because where sin enters, consequence follows. And the consequence was death. Not as a poetic metaphor, not as a distant concept, but as a new reality stamped into the human story like a seal. A boundary that had not existed in Eden now stood in the path of every future generation. From that moment forward, humanity would no longer move through endless days without decline. Human bodies would weaken, time would press down, and one day, every breath would become the last. The world did not simply become darker, it became mortal. And that is the true turning point of Eden. Not just that humanity sinned, but that sin opened a door creation had never needed before. A door marked ending. A door through which every life would eventually pass. And once that door was opened, it could not be closed by human hands. From that moment, death was no longer a stranger. Death became part of the human journey. And heaven in its perfect order, would soon appoint someone to carry out what humanity had unleashed. From the moment Eden was fractured, the world began to move under a new law, an invisible decree written into human flesh. one that no king could repeal and no warrior could defeat. Humanity would no longer stretch endlessly into eternity, as if time itself were a gentle river without an edge. Now life would follow a narrow path with boundaries on both sides. Birth, growth, weakening, and then the final threshold, death. Men and women would come into the world crying, build their lives under the sun, watch their strength fade like a flame losing oxygen, and one day feel the weight of an ending settle upon their bones. Children would bury parents, cities would rise and fall, generations would pass like wind through grass, and the earth, once the quiet floor of Eden, would become a place where bodies returned to dust again and again, until history itself would be layered with graves. And because death was now part of creation, it could not be treated as accident or chaos. Heaven is not disorder. Heaven is design. Every force has its place. Every role has its assignment. Every movement of creation answers to divine authority. If the human story now contained an ending, then that ending required a guardian, someone appointed not by fear, not by cruelty, not by whim, but by command. Because the soul is not merely breath, the soul is weight. The soul is sacred. The soul is eternal. And when the moment arrives, when the body reaches the limit written into it by the consequence of sin, something must separate what is temporary from what is everlasting. Someone must stand at that boundary between worlds, not as a judge handing down personal opinions, but as an executor of what God has already decreed. Someone must guide the soul away from the collapsing vessel of flesh and usher it toward whatever lies beyond: peace, reward, reckoning, judgment. But this task could not be given to just any angel. Among the hosts of heaven were many kinds of servants: warriors who shattered enemies, messengers who thundered divine words into human history, protectors who stood like fire around the faithful. Each role demanded strength, but this role demanded something rarer. To bring death is not simply to end a heartbeat. It is to carry the weight of finality without flinching. It is to look upon grief and not be moved off the path of obedience. It is to step into a room where life is slipping away and remain steady. Not because you are cold, but because you are faithful. It is to do what no one would choose, what no one would volunteer for, what even the pure might hesitate to touch, because it feels too heavy, too absolute, too holy in its terror. This is why the assignment was different. It required courage, not the courage of battle, but the courage of inevitability. It required obedience, not partial, not delayed, not emotional, but complete. And it required an unusual kind of strength. The strength to carry out the hardest command in creation without bitterness, without hesitation, without letting compassion become disobedience. Death had become law, and now heaven would choose who would enforce it. And when that choice was made, everything about one angel would change forever. Before death ever became a duty, before Azrael's name was spoken with trembling reverence, heaven itself moved with purpose toward the beginning of humanity. Because Adam was not formed from nothing, but from dust, from the substance of the earth, gathered and shaped into a vessel meant to carry something infinitely greater than soil: the breath of God. And so God gave a command that, on the surface, sounded simple. Go down to the earth, collect the dust, bring it back. But in the unseen realm, where creation listens, where the elements are not mere matter, but part of a living order, that command carried weight, because the earth was not ignorant of what was coming. The dust understood, in a way humans could not yet understand, that to be taken was to become the beginning of a story that would eventually end in burial. To be gathered was to be shaped into a body that would one day return again to the ground, broken by time, claimed by death. So when the first great angel was sent, the world itself responded. Some sources say Michael descended first. Michael, the heavenly commander, the one whose presence is like a banner of strength, whose voice is steady in the face of darkness, whose hands do not tremble in war. And yet when he approached the earth to take its soil, the ground cried out, as if creation could feel the cost of what was about to be born. The earth begged him not to take its dust, pleading to remain untouched, as though it already sensed the grief that would one day soak into its surface. Michael heard that cry, and for reasons tradition does not fully reveal, whether it was mercy, reverence, or a holy hesitation, he withdrew. He returned to God without the dust, not because he lacked power, but because something in him would not force creation to surrender what it was begging to keep. Then Gabriel was sent. Gabriel, the messenger who carries words that split history, the herald whose announcements reshape destiny. He approached the earth, and some traditions say he felt compassion rise within him like a tide. He saw the earth not as a resource to be used, but as a wounded thing pleading for mercy, and he could not bring himself to wound it further. And so Gabriel also returned, empty-handed. One by one the archangels came, and one by one they came back without the dust. Not because the command was unclear, not because God's will was weak, but because the task, even at the beginning, carried the shadow of what it would eventually become. Dust would become flesh. Flesh would become life, and life, now destined to taste sin, would eventually meet death. To take the dust was to set the entire human drama into motion. Love and betrayal, worship and rebellion, birth and burial, hope and heartbreak. And the angels felt it. They could fight, they could proclaim, they could stand against darkness. But to take the dust, to begin the story that would lead to graves, was a different kind of weight. So they returned to heaven with hands that held nothing, and yet hearts that carried something heavy. Because the earth had wept, and even heaven's greatest servants hesitated to be the ones who made it weep. But God's design would not remain unfinished. If humanity was to exist, the dust would be taken. And soon, God would send one more angel, an angel who would not turn back. Then God sent Azrael, and at that time, he was not yet the name that would one day be spoken at the edge of a final breath, not yet the presence associated with the severing of soul from flesh, not yet the figure whose shadow meant the last page had already been turned. He was simply one among the angels, faithful in a way that did not demand recognition, obedient in a way that did not require explanation, and silent in a way that carried its own strange authority. He descended toward the earth without spectacle, without the blazing drama that surrounds warriors, without the trumpet-like urgency of messengers, as if heaven itself understood that this mission did not belong to the language of glory, but to the language of necessity. And as he neared the ground, the world beneath him responded the same way it had responded before, because creation, even in its mute elements, is not blind to destiny. The earth wept, not with tears as humans would later know them, but with a grief that seemed to rise from the soil itself, a pleading vibration in the dust. Do not take what is mine. Do not tear from me what will one day return to me as death. Because the ground sensed what the angels sensed. To gather dust was not merely to collect material. It was to ignite a story so vast that it would fill the world with laughter and warfare, worship and betrayal, birth songs and funeral dirges, and the long, unavoidable procession of bodies returning to the place they came from. Michael had turned back when the earth cried out, because strength is not the same as forcing sorrow. Gabriel had turned back when compassion surged through him, because mercy is not the same as completing a command. But Azrael stood at the boundary where heaven's will met the earth's grief, and he did not retreat. Not because he was cruel, and not because he was unmoved, but because he possessed an unusual kind of strength that looks like stillness from the outside, even while it carries unbearable weight within. The strength to obey without letting emotion become resistance. The strength to complete what must be completed, even when every part of the moment feels like a wound. Some traditions say Azrael spoke softly to the earth, promising that what he took would not be stolen forever, that the dust would return in time, as if he already understood the cycle that was about to bind humanity to the ground. Other accounts say he said nothing at all, that he answered the earth's begging with a solemn silence, not to mock it, but because words were not his assignment, and because sometimes the most terrifying obedience is the kind that does not explain itself. And so he gathered the dust. He lifted it, even as the earth mourned. He carried it back to God, and with that single act, so simple in motion, so catastrophic in consequence, everything changed. Because Azrael proved what no other angel had proven in that hour, that he could bear the most difficult task without delay, without complaint, and without letting the sorrow of creation derail the command of the Creator. And heaven took notice, because the one who can begin the human story by taking dust, even while the earth weeps, is the one who can one day stand at the end of that story, when flesh collapses, when time expires, and when the soul must cross the final threshold. Azrael returned to the presence of God with the dust cradled in his hands. And though what he carried looked small, mere soil, mere earth, mere particles that could slip through fingers, the weight of it was greater than mountains, because it was not simply dust anymore. It was the beginning of humanity, the raw material of a story that would stretch across continents and centuries, through glory and ruin, through worship and rebellion, through tenderness and violence, until the world itself would groan beneath the consequences of the first disobedience. And heaven understood what had just happened, not because the other angels were weak, and not because they lacked devotion, but because there are certain assignments so heavy that strength alone cannot lift them. They require a rarer kind of power, the power to obey when obedience is emotionally unbearable, the power to carry out what must be done without delay, without complaint, and without letting compassion, hesitation, or fear interfere with the command of the Creator. Michael had the courage to face enemies. Gabriel had the purity to carry divine messages into human history. But Azrael had proven something different, that he could step into the trembling grief of creation itself and still complete the mission. He did not argue with heaven. He did not negotiate with sorrow. He did not wait for the moment to feel easier. He simply obeyed. And because he obeyed, because he carried the hardest task without the need for praise, without the need for reassurance, without needing the universe to understand him, God gave him a role unlike any other in all the hierarchy of angels. A role that would not unfold in battlefields or royal courts, and would not be celebrated by crowds, and would not be announced with trumpets, but would quietly touch every human life that would ever be born. From that point forward, Azrael was entrusted with the most sacred boundary in creation, the passage between beginning and end. He would be the one who watched the story start, and the one who stood at its final sentence. He would be the one assigned to the soul itself, to the invisible part of humanity that does not rot, does not fade, does not die the way flesh dies. His task was not merely to end life, but to shepherd the soul through the moment when the body's time expires, separating what is temporary from what is eternal, and guiding that soul beyond the veil toward whatever awaited on the other side. peace, reward, or judgment, according to the divine will that governs all things. And so Azrael was no longer simply an angel. He became Malak al-Maut, the angel of death, not as a title of cruelty, but as a function of divine order, because death was now part of the world, and the world required someone who could carry that role without being swallowed by it. And here is the haunting irony written into his name. Azrael, often understood to mean help of God in Hebrew, became linked forever with the very task most beings would flee from, the task of helping the soul cross the threshold no one can avoid.
Help, not in the way humans often imagine comfort, but help in the truest sense. An appointed escort, a necessary guide, a servant of God, ensuring that the soul does not drift into chaos, but passes from this life into the next exactly as the Creator has designed. Because in a world where sin had opened the door to death, Azrael became the one assigned to stand at that door, faithful, silent, and unstoppable, until every story reached its appointed end. Most people speak of Azrael as if his only purpose is to extinguish a life, as if he is nothing more than the final shadow at the edge of a hospital bed, the cold hand that closes a mouth that will never speak again, the silent figure who arrives to take what the living are desperate to keep. But that is only the surface of his role, the part that terrifies the human imagination, because humans fear endings more than they understand them. Azrael's true work begins where the body's strength stops. His central responsibility, across the traditions that speak his name, is not random, not impulsive, and never driven by emotion. It is precise, appointed, and governed by divine will. He separates the soul from the body at the exact moment decreed, the moment written into destiny, long before the dying person ever understood how fragile their days would be. And that separation is not described as a simple act, because the soul is not a loose thread easily pulled free. It is bound to flesh by experience, memory, love, regret, hope, fear, by every moment that ever made life feel real. To sever that bond is to break something profound, something intimate, something that feels like a world collapsing from the inside. Yet even here, Azrael is not portrayed as a monster. He is portrayed as a function of order, a servant of God who does not decide who dies and who lives, but who arrives when heaven commands, because death, once introduced into the human story, must occur within divine structure, not chaos. That is why many religious texts and oral traditions describe Azrael not only as the angel who ends the earthly connection, but as something more complex and more unsettling. A psychopomp, a guide of souls, a being whose role is not merely to close the door behind you, but to lead you through the doorway you cannot walk through alone. This is where the fear becomes deeper, but also where the meaning becomes heavier. Because if Azrael were only an executioner, then his presence would be pure terror. But as a guide, he becomes the agent of transition, the one who escorts the soul away from the crumbling vessel of flesh and into the unseen realm that awaits beyond the limits of human sight. He does not just cut the bond between body and spirit. He carries the spirit forward, ensuring that what leaves the body does not drift, does not vanish, does not dissolve into nothingness, but moves deliberately, inevitably, toward the next stage. And that next stage is not the same for every soul. Some journeys lead toward peace, toward reward, toward rest beyond suffering. Others lead toward judgment, toward reckoning, toward the terrifying clarity of what a life truly was. But regardless of where that road leads, Azrael is the one who initiates it. He is the one who opens the passage when the appointed hour arrives. Not because he delights in endings,
but because the great design of God includes both beginning and conclusion, both breath and silence, both entrance and exit. To understand Azrael is to understand this: he is not only the angel of death, he is the keeper of the threshold. And once the threshold opens, the soul must step through. There is a detail hidden inside the old traditions, one that transforms Azrael from a frightening symbol into something far more chilling, because it ties his work not to chance, not to human unpredictability, but to destiny itself. They say Azrael carries a divine record, a scroll, sometimes described as a book, upon which the names of all human beings are written, not as ink on parchment alone, but as a living register of existence, an ongoing testimony that every life is known, counted, and held within the awareness of heaven. When a person is born, their name is added. When a person dies, their name is erased. And in that simple image, a name appearing, a name vanishing, there is an unbearable weight, because it implies something the modern world fights to forget: that life is not an accident wandering through time, but a measured journey, moving toward an appointed boundary. This scroll is not merely a list. It is the sign that Azrael does not appear randomly, does not wander the earth hunting for souls, does not strike like a thief acting on impulse. He waits. He watches. He stands in readiness, not as a predator, but as a servant whose task activates only when the divine will declares the hour has arrived. This is what makes him so different from the way people imagine death in folklore. Azrael does not act based on emotion. He does not remove a soul because he is angry or pleased or offended or moved by personal judgment. He does not choose who lives longer and who falls sooner. He is not the author of fate. He is the executor of what has already been decreed. And that distinction is everything, because it means Azrael is terrifying not because he is cruel, but because he is exact. His presence is not the chaos of tragedy. His presence is the certainty of a command fulfilled. And here the contrast becomes sharp enough to cut. Lucifer, rebellious, self-willed, a creature who turned his freedom into defiance, represents the rupture of obedience, the spiritual disaster of acting apart from God. Michael, radiant commander, warrior of heaven, moves through conflict, leading battles on God's behalf, confronting darkness with force and victory. But Azrael is something else entirely. Neither rebel nor warrior, neither tempter nor conqueror, but a figure of function, pure obedience distilled into a role that touches every life without exception. Because while other angels serve in specific moments, specific places, specific assignments, protecting one person, delivering one message, waging one war, Azrael's reach extends across every nation, every language, every generation, from the first ancient graves to the last breath of the modern world. No border slows him, no mountain hides from him, no palace outranks him, no wilderness escapes his awareness. From the tallest peaks to the deepest cities, from forgotten villages to crowded empires, every soul eventually passes through the boundary he oversees. And this is why the scroll matters. It reveals that Azrael does not come because life is weak. He comes because the appointed time has spoken. And when the name is erased, the door opens, the threshold appears, and the soul begins the journey it cannot delay, guided by the angel whose obedience has never once faltered. What makes Azrael even more unsettling is that, in many traditions, he is not portrayed as a lone figure wandering the earth like a solitary shadow. He is described as the head of a vast, ordered system, an unseen network of spiritual agents moving beneath the surface of the world, carrying out the quiet work of transition with a precision that mirrors the discipline of heaven itself. In other words, Azrael is not only a servant who obeys, he is also a leader who commands. Because Azrael does not always appear in person. Again and again, religious texts and oral accounts suggest that he often sends lesser beings, sometimes referred to collectively as the angels of death in the plural, to carry out the act of collecting souls under his direction, as if his authority extends through ranks of assistants who move at his signal, like an invisible procession crossing homes, battlefields, deserts, palaces, and prisons, without ever being stopped by walls or distance. This detail matters because it shows that Azrael's task is not simply personal, it is cosmic in scale, requiring an organized reach that can touch every life, in every place, at every moment. And these assisting angels are not described as identical. Some are said to come with gentleness, arriving like a quiet dusk settling over a room, easing the soul away from the body with mercy, as if the final moment is meant to be an escort rather than an assault. Others are described as terrifying, heavy, severe, because the manner of the encounter is believed to reflect the state of the soul and the destiny that awaits it. In this way, the angels of death become a living mirror. For the righteous, they are often portrayed as calm guides. For those marked by cruelty or rebellion, they can appear as agents of fear, because the end does not merely arrive, it reveals. And when the world convulses, when war erupts, when disaster strikes, when famine, plague, or catastrophe tears through cities and leaves bodies in its wake, this system is described as expanding with frightening speed, as if Azrael's reach stretches outward through his assistants to meet the magnitude of mass death, ensuring that the boundary between life and afterlife is not breached by chaos. The scale is chilling. Countless lives, countless endings, all flowing through an ordered spiritual mechanism that never sleeps, never tires, never loses track. Yet the traditions also carry a second, sharper detail, one that makes Azrael feel even more real, because it suggests that there are moments when he does not delegate. In certain accounts, Azrael comes personally, especially to those whose lives carried unusual spiritual weight, saints, prophets, and individuals whose deaths were not merely personal endings, but meaningful thresholds in the story of faith. In such cases, his presence is described with a strange reverence, as though the soul is not taken by an anonymous messenger, but received by the one entrusted with the boundary itself, Azrael, the angel of death, stepping forward not out of cruelty, but out of divine appointment. And that is what turns fear into awe. Because if Azrael commands an entire host of death angels, and if he can still choose to appear himself when a life carries sacred significance, then his role is not minor, not symbolic, and not distant. It is active, organized, unavoidable. A silent kingdom of transition operating beneath the visible world until every name, in its appointed hour, reaches the edge of its final line. Ancient depictions often try to tame angels into something the human mind can tolerate. A glowing figure, a gentle face, soft feathers, a comforting outline that fits neatly into paintings and children's stories. But the older Islamic descriptions of Azrael refuse to be domesticated, because they insist that the being entrusted with separating every soul from its body cannot look like something ordinary, cannot be contained by human proportions, and cannot be explained by the language we use for familiar things. In these traditions, Azrael's true form is not merely large, it is overwhelming, vast enough to feel less like a creature and more like a living horizon, as if death itself has been given shape and placed under divine command. And one of the first details that shatters the imagination is this. He is said to have 4 faces, each turned toward a different direction, north, south, east, and west, so that no corner of the world sits outside his awareness, no hidden valley escapes his gaze, and no distant shore can pretend it is unseen. This is not described to make him theatrical. It is described to make one point unmistakable. Azrael's duty is global, and his attention cannot be narrowed, because the end of life comes everywhere, to everyone. But the faces are only the beginning. Some Islamic scholars and classical commentators, names like Ibn Zafar al-Wa'iz, are often mentioned in these discussions, described Azrael as possessing 70,000 feet or limbs, not as a random exaggeration, but as an attempt to express how one being could interact with countless souls across nations and eras, how one appointed servant could fulfill a task that touches every household, every battlefield, every sickbed, every last breath that ever rises and falls. These numbers function like a spiritual grammar for immensity, not meant to satisfy curiosity, but meant to force the listener to feel the weight of a role too large for ordinary form. Because if Azrael's assignment is to stand at the boundary of every life, then his form, in these traditions, must also stand beyond what the human mind can comfortably imagine. And that is precisely the point. There is a detail in the older narrations about Azrael that does not merely frighten the imagination, it reorganizes it, because it suggests that his form is not a fixed statue standing somewhere in the unseen realm, but a living reflection of humanity itself, as though the angel of death is designed to remain permanently synchronized with the fragile breathing population of the earth. In many traditions, Azrael is described as being entirely covered with eyes and tongues. And this is not offered as poetic decoration, but as a terrifying mechanism of awareness. Each eye, each tongue, is said to be connected to a living soul on earth at that very moment, meaning his body becomes a kind of spiritual census, a moving record of the world's life force written onto his own being. The implication is chilling, because it means Azrael does not need to search for anyone, and he does not discover a death when it happens. He is already linked, already aware, already present in the way a shadow is present when light exists. And then comes the part that makes this image truly unsettling. When a person dies, one of those eyes or one of those tongues disappears. It vanishes from his form, as if the life it represented has been erased, as if the soul's departure leaves a visible absence on the very body of the one appointed to separate soul from flesh. In this way, Azrael's appearance is not constant. It is described as constantly shifting according to how many human beings are alive on the planet, rising and diminishing like a living tide, so that his form becomes a mirror of the world's mortality, always changing, always counting, always responding to the endless cycle of names being written into existence and then removed. Some narrations add even more imagery to express the scale of his authority, describing Azrael as carrying a flaming whip, not as a weapon of random cruelty, but as a symbol of divine command, an emblem of enforcement and control over the other spiritual beings who assist him, a sign that the realm of transition is not chaos, but order, and that even lesser death angels move when authority moves. And then there is the image that collapses distance into nothing. Accounts that say the entire earth appears to Azrael as small as a bowl in his hand, no larger than a tiny dish, implying that borders, oceans, mountains, and cities are not obstacles to him, because he does not travel the way creatures travel. He reaches without effort, touches without delay, and arrives without the limitations that define the physical world. And if that were not enough to convey the magnitude, some traditions go further still by comparing him to the bearers of the throne, those immense angels said to uphold the very throne of God. And yet, according to certain scholars, Azrael is described as greater in scale than even they are, not because of vanity, but because the function he carries spans every nation and every era, from the first breath to the last. And once you begin to see him this way, you understand why his presence was never merely feared by humans. It was respected even in heaven. Because Azrael is not terrifying for what he wants, but for what he is. The living boundary between life and what comes next. This is the point where the fear surrounding Azrael becomes something deeper than horror. Because the oldest traditions do not present him as terrifying in the way a villain is terrifying, cruel, malicious, hungry for suffering, but in the way a boundary is terrifying, cold in its certainty, absolute in its authority, unmoved by pleading, and beyond the reach of strength. Azrael is feared not because he enjoys endings, but because he embodies the reality that endings are unavoidable, and that even the greatest beings in the unseen realm must yield when the final command is spoken. That is why the legends say even exalted angels regarded him with reverence. Not because Azrael stood against them, but because he stood beyond them, outside the categories of battle and message, outside the storylines of war and revelation, belonging instead to the final chapter that comes for every creature. Warriors can win. Messengers can be rejected. Conflicts can be delayed. But the end cannot be negotiated. Azrael does not arrive to argue. He arrives to complete. And yet, what makes him even more unsettling is this. Azrael is not described as appearing in one fixed form to every person. His presence is said to shift depending on the condition of the soul that beholds him, as if the angel of death is not only an agent of transition, but also a mirror held up at the most exposed moment of human existence, when all masks fall away and only the truth of the inner life remains. For the righteous, saints, prophets, and those whose hearts are described as deeply faithful, Azrael is often portrayed not as darkness, but as peace, not as terror, but as calm, sometimes even radiant, as though mercy itself has taken shape to guide the soul gently across the threshold. In these narrations, death is not an assault, but an escort. The soul is given room to understand what is happening, to loosen its grip on the world, to step forward as if into warm light rather than into a void. But for those who lived with cruelty, dishonesty, or rebellion buried in their spirit, the image changes. Azrael appears heavy, cold, overwhelming, like the atmosphere itself has thickened into judgment, and the separation is described not as lifting, but as tearing, not as comfort, but as force, as though the soul is being ripped from the body because it refuses to release what it has clung to. In those moments, the terror is not only Azrael's presence, it is the soul recognizing what it has become, and realizing too late that the end reveals more than it takes. This duality is emphasized with particular clarity in Sufi thought, which frames Azrael as a reflection of the soul's deepest state at the moment of death. If the soul is at peace, Azrael appears as peace. If the soul is filled with resistance, fear, and spiritual dissonance, Azrael appears in a form that mirrors that struggle. Because the final meeting does not simply happen to the soul, it exposes the soul. And the traditions go further still, claiming that Azrael is not only encountered at the final breath. He can appear in dreams and visions when the appointed time draws near, sometimes as warning, sometimes as mercy, sometimes as a quiet invitation to prepare. Stories passed down through generations speak of figures like Rumi, who is said to have met Azrael in a human form as death approached, not with panic, but with calm acceptance. And Nasir Khusraw, who wrote of seeing Azrael in a dream that urged him toward reflection, prayer, and readiness. And when you understand this, the reason for the reverence becomes clear. Azrael is not simply a character in the story. He is the certainty that the story ends. And that certainty, even in heaven, commands silence. There is a question that hangs over Azrael's name like a veil of smoke. Because the more you listen to the ancient narrations, the more you realize the traditions describe a moment so unbearable that it feels like a scene from the beginning of judgment. Angels who had stood in the courts of heaven, who had moved through realms of fire and light, who had carried commands that shaped the world, looked upon death and collapsed. Not for an instant, not for an hour. They fainted for 1,000 years, as if the sheer reality of what death represented, finality, separation, the absolute boundary beyond which no creature can carry its old life, was too heavy for their minds to hold. And if even angels fell before death, what does that tell you about the magnitude of it? What kind of creation must death be if beings made of light and obedience could not remain standing in its presence? What kind of terror is finality if heaven itself, so disciplined, so ordered, could be stunned into silence by simply beholding it? This is where Azrael's role becomes even more chilling. Because these narrations do not suggest that Azrael emerged from death, as if death birthed him or shaped him into its servant. They suggest the opposite. God placed Azrael above death, not as a rival, but as an appointed authority, as the one entrusted to command the boundary that death represents. In other words, death was not Azrael's master. Death was a creation under divine rule, and Azrael was given the responsibility to administer it. Like a key-bearer stationed at the doorway between life and what comes after, holding the authority to open that door only when God commands. And that is the terrifying order of it. Azrael is not the chaos of death roaming freely, choosing at random, striking without permission. He is the obedience of heaven, assigned to the most absolute limit in creation, the one who stands at the edge of every human life, not because he is cruel, but because God's design required a guardian of the threshold. Because once death exists, the world needs more than fear. It needs divine order. And Azrael is that order, placed over the boundary so final that even angels once fell before it. And then the story stretches beyond the limits of history, beyond empires, beyond graves, beyond the last pages of the human timeline. Because the traditions do not end with Azrael endlessly collecting souls, as if death is an eternal law that will always reign. They insist on something even more startling, that death itself has an end, and that when the end of death arrives, Azrael's purpose, so vast, so relentless, so absolute, will finally be completed. After Judgment Day, when every soul has been gathered, when every life has been weighed in the light of divine truth, when paradise and hell stand fully divided and no boundary remains undecided, the narrations describe one final scene, a moment so symbolic and so severe that it feels like creation's last heartbeat before eternity settles in. They say God will bring death itself forward, no longer hidden as a concept, no longer stalking the world as an unseen law, but manifested in a form creation can witness, often described in Hadith traditions as a ram, a creature placed between heaven and hell, like a living emblem of everything that once separated the living from the dead. And there, in the presence of all creation, God will slay the ram. In that moment, death dies, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but truly. Its function ended, its authority erased, its reign broken, as if the very boundary that haunted humanity since Eden is struck down by the one who authored time. And the meaning is thunderous. There will be no more funerals, no more endings, no more slow decay, no more last breaths stolen by weakness, because the thing that made endings possible has been destroyed. And with death's end comes the completion of Azrael's circle. Because if Azrael was appointed to stand at the threshold between life and what comes after, then once the threshold is no longer needed, once death itself has been slain, Azrael's task can finally cease. The angel who carried the most relentless responsibility in creation, the one whose silent obedience touched every generation, will have done everything heaven assigned him to do. His work will be finished. The last name will have been gathered. The last crossing will have been escorted. The final boundary will have been enforced, and then dissolved forever. And this is where the idea becomes even more profound, almost unsettling in its depth. Some mystics and scholars have suggested that Azrael did not merely deliver death as a servant delivers a message, but that he became the very form through which death operated in the world. Death following him like a shadow follows a body, his functions so closely fused with finality that, in practice, he became what death looked like under divine command. Not because he was death by nature, but because God's will shaped him into the instrument through which death moved. So when death ends, it is not only a cosmic event, it is a closure, a final sealing of the chapter that began in Eden when sin opened the door. And beyond that sealed chapter, eternity begins. Not as endless time measured in days, but as a reality where time no longer threatens, where endings no longer stalk, where the long wound of mortality is finally healed. Azrael, the angel of death, will have completed the full circle, and then silence will not mean loss anymore. It will mean forever. Over the centuries, as the story of Azrael traveled beyond deserts and sacred texts, beyond oral tradition and theological commentary, it began to cross into the wider imagination of the world. Because human beings have always tried to give a face to the one reality they cannot escape. And whenever cultures speak about death, they instinctively reach for symbols. A dark cloak, a sickle, a skeletal figure standing in the fog, the familiar shadow of the grim reaper. And yet, what most people do not realize is that Azrael is not the grim reaper in the way modern folklore portrays him. Not a cold predator, not a cruel force that delights in fear, not a figure who chooses victims according to personal whim. Azrael, in the traditions that shaped his name, is something far more solemn and far more ordered. He does not act as a judge issuing personal verdicts. He acts as a servant executing God's will, arriving only at the appointed hour, carrying out a function that exists because the Creator designed boundaries into time, into life, into the human journey itself. That distinction is why Azrael has been feared, but also honored. Because he is not chaos wearing a face, he is divine order standing at the threshold. And because this image carried such weight, writers and poets in the West could not resist it. In the 19th century, the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow referenced Azrael as an angel who gently collects souls, framing him not as a monster, but as a solemn presence whose silence is heavy with meaning. Around the same era, Leigh Hunt wrote The Reaper and the Flowers, portraying Azrael as a quiet figure in black who arrives not to harm, but to guide, an echo of the ancient idea that death is not only an ending, but a passage. Even G.K. Chesterton, with his sharp spiritual imagination, referenced Azrael in poetry as a powerful force connected to moments of immense spiritual weight, keeping the name alive far beyond its original context, like a symbol that refused to disappear. And then, in a strange twist only culture can create, Azrael's name slipped into pop culture, into the unexpected, even the lighthearted. In the 1980s cartoon The Smurfs, the villain Gargamel named his cat Azrael, a tiny detail that feels almost like an accidental confession. Even in a children's world, the name still carried a shadow of the mysterious, the dark, and the inevitable. Which raises the question that now belongs to you. Now that you've heard the story, now that you've traced Azrael from dust to destiny, from silent obedience to the edge of eternity, how do you see him? as a dark figure to fear, or as a guardian of life's final step? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story opened your eyes, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, because next, we're going deeper into the shadows with our movie on Lucifer, the angel who became the devil. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again,